Welcome to 40 Days with Jesus. This is day 12 of our 40-day journey together, and hopefully you've already had a great experience as we spent time together in the Gospel of John. Today, we're in the Gospel of John chapter 6, and we're picking up for the second half, or maybe even a little more than the second half, picking up at verse 25. And the day before, if you'll remember, Jesus, a couple things had happened. One, he had fed 5,000 people. They had fish and bread, and it must have been some amazing bread. Later that evening, Jesus went out and walked on the water. As the disciples went ahead of him in the boat to the other side of the lake, Jesus walked out on the water to them, got in the boat, and they went across the lake. When they got there the next day, we find out that they had found him. The group of people, the great crowd of people had came looking for Jesus as they found him on the other side. And they asked Jesus, when did you get here? Well, how did you leave? Because they never saw Jesus leave. Again, Jesus didn't get in a boat and leave like everybody else. Jesus walked across on the water, and or at least walked most of the way across and got in the boat and finished the trip with his disciples. And Jesus says, these are some pretty powerful words. Jesus knew the heart of these people. He said, I tell you the truth, you were looking for me not because you saw the miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Do not work for the food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. On him God the Father has placed his seal of approval. Jesus is saying that these people weren't following because of recognizing him as the Messiah, or seeing the signs and kind of putting it together that this is something from God. What they saw was food that filled their belly. And I don't know what kind of bread Jesus multiplied, or maybe it was the bread that the little boy had, and the same bread was multiplied across fishing bread. But this bread had drawn the people and drawn them enough that they'd walked or traveled however they got to the other side of the lake, and they were there looking for Jesus because of the bread. And they said, ask a pretty important question next after Jesus' accusation. They said, what must we do to work the work that God requires? What have we got to do to do God work? And I love Jesus' answer here. Jesus says the work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. Jesus says, all you have to do to accomplish the work of God is just to put your faith in me. Believe in me. When we really believe in Jesus, we're going to do the things that he's told us to do. We're going to accomplish the things on this earth that Jesus has already given us an example to follow and has commanded us to do. So they said, well, what miraculous sign will you give us so that we will believe you? They're chasing after a miracle here, looking for something else, and probably looking for more of the bread that they had the day before. Again, it must have been amazing bread, because they say our forefathers ate manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. And they're wanting a miracle like Moses, the experience of being with Moses in the desert. And Jesus says, I'll tell you the truth, it was not Moses who gave them this bread, but this was God who gave them this bread. And for the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Again, Jesus is setting himself up here. The bread of God is he that comes from heaven and gives life to the world. Life. Remember that word. And the people said, now give us this bread. Again, they're chasing after a bread. They don't quite understand it. And then Jesus says these powerful words, I am the bread of life. Jesus says that he was that nourishment that gives us real life. He says, who comes to me will never go hungry, and who believes in me will never be thirsty. And Jesus continues with this idea. And then in verse 40 he says, for the Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life, and I will raise him at the last day. Everyone who looks and believes will have eternal life. John wrote for a very specific purpose. If you remember John 20, verse 31, towards the end, John will tell us why he wrote. He said, but these things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and then believing you may have life in his name. John says he wants us to believe and to have life. In verse 40 here, Jesus talks of himself and says the Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life. Jesus says that the Father wants us too. Jesus expresses himself, and he's continued to express this idea, but to believe and to have life. And he says it again here, and he'll say it again before we finish this chapter out a couple more times, maybe in different ways. The Jews began to grumble. because Jesus talked about this idea of eternal life. Well, not that, but that Jesus said that he was the bread that came down from heaven. They said that they were concerned. I am the bread that came from heaven. Because they're thinking, how could Jesus come from heaven? Because we know Jesus' mom and dad. We know Jesus was born, of Mary and Joseph. They certainly did not understand Jesus' actual birth and what happened in the process. They saw him as being a physical person born to two physical parents. And how could he possibly be the one from heaven? In verse 43, Jesus says, "Stop grumbling among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father has drawn him." And he goes through this experience of his relation again to the Father and the drawing of people towards him. And again, we'll repeat. But he said, as this section ends, that he is the bread that comes down from heaven. And then the last phrase here really gets to the people who are his listeners. He says, this bread that comes down from heaven is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. You get this? Jesus says the bread that I'm talking about is my flesh, my body, and I'm going to give it for the life of the world. And we understand this as we look back, going that Jesus was going to die and sacrifice himself that we might have life. Certainly they didn't understand it, and their thoughts about what Jesus was saying. How can this man give us his flesh to eat? Because Jesus said, you're going to have to eat this bread. And so they were grasping at this. How could this man give his flesh that we might eat it? That he's going to ask us this kind of a thing? Is this impossible? And then Jesus, even hearing from that question, he goes much deeper very quickly. He says, I tell you, this is verse 53, I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Now this is a tie-in to the multiple times he's already said in the same chapter that you must believe in the Son of Man and he will give you life. And he said it in different places, in different ways, but this time he's saying it in a very different way. He says, unless you eat his flesh and drink his blood, you will not have life. Jesus isn't talking about the physical eating of his flesh and drinking of his blood. Jesus is talking about the spiritual existence. Again, we must eat physical food, and the Jews were searching for this manna, this physical food, and Jesus says that you can eat that food and then you will die. Physically, you eat food and you die. But if you spiritually absorb this food that Jesus offers, his life, he calls it his eating his flesh and drinking his blood, which is to absorb his life, and then we receive sustenance for spiritual life that goes on forever. The concept here, when Jesus says to eat my flesh and drink my blood, is not physically eating his flesh and drinking his blood, but it is to believe. The same thing he said multiple times throughout this section, that we must believe, and when we believe, we will experience life that goes on forever. And this challenge that he gives here, though, he goes over and hits it very hard, that you've got to eat his flesh, drink his blood, and he says, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. And for my flesh is real food, my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. And he's speaking in a spiritual context, which they can't grasp again here in this physical thing that Jesus speaks of. And then he says, just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live. It sounds very similar to something Jesus said just a couple of days ago as we were together, that the Father has life, he gives it to the Son, and that life that the Son has, he passes on to those who will put their faith in him. Life, life, life. The Father wants us to experience life. Jesus wants us to experience life. And John says, I wrote that you would experience life. He wants us to have life that's only available in Jesus. And then Jesus finishes out the section and says, this is the bread that came down from heaven. Again, this is where he started out the idea that there was this bread that came from heaven, not manna, as their experience with bread or their thoughts about bread coming from heaven. He says, your forefathers ate manna and died, but he who feeds on this bread will live forever. Live life. Again, this is all through this section. Jesus talks about the idea of life and believing in him. After he said this, something happened. Something strange happened. Lots of people who were following Jesus, and John uses the word disciples, and disciples is used to reference multiple concepts. The same word. One is the disciples, his 12 apostles. Sometimes John will use that word to mean those 12 apostles. Other times John will mean those people who were following him because they believed in him. And times John used the word disciple meaning anybody who was following Jesus, believers and non-believers. But at this point he says disciples, and it says that many of them said that this is a hard teaching. Nobody can accept this teaching. This is what Jesus just said is just way too deep, and maybe they're still thinking in the physical. There's no way we can eat his flesh and drink his blood. So that these people decided that they were done, and they quit following Jesus. They turned and went away. And Jesus looks to his 12 while people were deserting Jesus at this point, and Jesus looks to his 12 and says, "You do not want to leave too, do you?" Thinking that the 12 were done too. Maybe they were not going to follow either. And again, our man Peter speaks up, who seems to be that guy who speaks up as a representing everybody else. And Peter says some pretty powerful words here. This is verse 68. "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We believe and know that you are the Holy One of God." Peter recognized that Jesus had the words of life, that if they could just invest in what Jesus was saying and speaking and put faith in that and believe in that's where they experienced eternal life. And they wanted, Peter saying, we want to stay, we want to follow you, we want to be with you no matter what. And that's the experience. Well, I want to challenge you to do the same thing. Whatever Jesus says, are you ready to follow it no matter what? Because there are going to be some times when Jesus is going to challenge us to do some hard things, some things that just doesn't make sense. And he'll say things like, love your enemies. You know, people who are doing things to hurt you, to destroy you, love them. That doesn't make sense in our world, in our culture. Jesus will say, turn the other cheek. Somebody hit you, turn and let them hit you again. That doesn't make sense. But those are the kind of powerful things that Jesus teaches. And Jesus moves us on to experience this life the way that he wants us to experience love the way he wants us to experience it, and to share that love with our world. And I want to encourage you, go back, read this chapter again, look at what Jesus said. Would you go wherever Jesus would lead? Because for many of us, it's even though we may say we would, there are times when we're going to say, that's just too hard for me to do right now. Hopefully it's not. Hopefully you'll step up, follow the words of Jesus, because they offer life. And so often we miss out on life because we're not willing to follow Jesus. Follow Jesus wherever he leads. Hey, read John chapter 6 again. I will see you tomorrow, 40 Days with Jesus.